Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's New England Hymns webinar presented by premier sponsor Proofpoint, Prioritizing People, a Human-Centric Approach to Cybersecurity in Healthcare, presented by Ryan Witt and Chris Montgomery. Ryan currently serves as Vice President, Industry Solutions, and is responsible for the strategy and solutions for the Proofpoint's healthcare business. He is also the chair of Proofpoint's Healthcare Advisory Board and is currently serving a 2-year term on the HIMSS Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Security Committee. Based in Silicon Valley, Ryan works closely with healthcare industry leaders to demonstrate the value of data security as a core component of patient safety and as a key enabler for enhancing access to high-quality patient care, reducing the cost of care, and ultimately improving patient outcomes. Prior to Proofpoint, he held healthcare leadership positions at Fortinet and Juniper Networks and was the chair of both companies' healthcare advisory boards. All lines have been muted upon entry today. Please send all questions via the Q&A box that you see below. Please join me in welcoming Ryan today, who will also introduce Chris Montgomery.
Thank you very much. Very delighted to be here. Glad to spend some time with you talking about cybersecurity in a healthcare context. My name is Ryan Witt. You heard my bio, so I don't need to go into any more detail. I'm dialing in from San Francisco, so I guess a long way from the New England chapter, but please put in chat where you guys are dialing in from. Really happy to have Chris Montgomery join me today, so we can kind of go through some what we think is really interesting data about where the threat activity is most acute from a healthcare context. You'll hear me talk about this a lot over the next half hour or so, 40 minutes or so. We believe from a human-centric approach in terms of carving out or creating your cybersecurity strategy, a key component or a key variable is just understanding where you're likely to be attacked. So we'll have some data on that front. Chris, do you want to give a quick overview before we kick off with the presentation?
Yeah, sure. Happy to be here. And I think you nailed it. It's one of these things where we're going to look at a problem, a data-centric, data leaving the organization is a bad thing. Protecting the ability to deliver care is something that we want to protect. You'll hear about the problem that you're trying to solve in the first part. The second part is going to be, can we take a unique perspective and look at where to start first in addressing that problem and allowing from a planning perspective, not necessarily a running at your pager today thing, but when I get up in the morning, what is the first thing that I need to address based upon what's actually happening in the field? And so that's the perspective that we're going to look at in part two that we hope will be very helpful and certainly that I think you'll find is very unique.
Cool, thank you. Just a quick overview. I don't want to assume any sort of knowledge about Proofpoint, and I don't want this to be a commercial either. So I just want to have one slide here for framing about who we are as an organization and the work that we do. We are all about essentially protecting people and defending data. Threat actors these days, for the most part, are targeting most of their activity on people, how they work, the messaging tools they tend to use, and they want to dupe those people, those staff, those clinicians, those nurses, et cetera, to hand over some pieces of information, ideally credentials, but basically helping them to assemble this sort of complex jigsaw puzzle about the organization they're sorting attack. So all the threats are really oriented around attacking people. If we had this presentation, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, we would talk about zero-day threats or patches not being deployed in a network as a vulnerability, et cetera. It's not that is not an important threat vector, of course that it is, but there's so much data these days around people are the focus of the attacks. And then also just stopping, if somebody were to break into your organization, stopping the exfiltration of data. These days it's largely a monetization angle. People are attacking because they're trying to monetize their attack in most cases. Whether that's a redirect of a payment, or that's stealing money, whether that's an extortion play, which we see quite a lot of these days, whether that's stealing IP, um, controlled substances, etc. So we're trying to stop that exfiltration of data. That's Proofpoint in a nutshell. And that is the end of the infomercial. This is a quick slide here, and I don't really want to belabor any of these points, but we are about to make a lot of assertions about where we see the threat activity is most acute in a very granular fashion within healthcare. And I just want you to understand that we have very broad adoption of our technology within multiple industries and certainly within healthcare. And that gives us an ability to see a lot of traffic, a lot of threat activity, and the conclusions that we're going to show you in a few moments here about where the threat activity is happening is just based on this level of adoption. Okay, before we get into the data, I just want to kind of like set the scene about why we think this is important. So we at Proofpoint have been partnering with the Ponemon Institute for 3 years now. This is our third year. We've released this report called The Insecurity in Healthcare. This got released literally about a month ago. So this data is relatively hot off the press, as research data and threat data can be hot off the press. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of key findings about what we have found here. And it sets the scene about why we think this is such an important topic. So just high level, what are some of the things that we saw? Almost all organizations, 92%, had at least one cyber attack over the last 12 months. This is some research from Ponemon. Total cost of the single most expensive attack that was experienced in the last 12 months was almost $5 million. That number keeps going up. That's obviously a very significant sum of money if you unfortunately have, a victim of these sort of attacks. And what is often less talked about is just how much disruption there is to healthcare operations. So that's almost $1.5 million. And I don't really want to get into the metrics about how Ponemon measures this. They have been doing this for many, many, many years now. And we're more interested in the trend lines because you could always look at these things and say, well, is that the right thing to be measuring, or should we include all these sort of factors in our calculation? And yes, maybe no. I don't want to argue their algorithm, but the trend lines are important, and the trend lines are unfortunately all going the wrong direction, i.e., that it's getting more and more expensive when these events do occur. This report focuses really on four sort of attack types. A cloud account compromise, and that means somebody essentially penetrated a private or hybrid cloud, and those were those attacks there. Attacks on the supply chain, a very prevalent attack vector these days. Concern around ransomware, and the most costly form of attack, which is impersonation attacks. BEC attacks, that's the FBI terminology, BEC being business email compromise, fraudulent attacks, so vulnerability there as well. And that as an aside, attacks in that area are the most costly form of attacks that happen in healthcare and any other industry for that matter. They may not be the most critical attacks because they're not shutting down systems necessarily, but in terms of just pure dollars lost, that's the most impactful attack. So we looked at this. There's a lot of detail in this report, so I'm just going to summarize the how this has disrupted patient care over the 3 years we've been measuring this. And you can kind of see the impact on those 4 attacks on patient care disruption as measured by the various colors over the 3 years that we measured this. Supply chain attacks clearly are very disruptive, as are ransomware, both trending in the wrong direction. We see it relatively consistent with regards to impersonation, spoofing attacks, and then cloud seems to be bouncing a little bit all over the place. This is probably the slide that I want to emphasize the most in this sort of discussion before we get on to some of the research. Ponymon, they look a lot like, okay, patient care is being disrupted. What is the actual impact to patient care? What's the impact to that institution's ability to essentially meet its mission, that mission being provide patient care, patient safety, or words to that effect? And they looked at delays in procedures and tests resulting in poorer outcomes for patients, and you can kind of see um, the various forms of attack and how that's impacted. Does patients have a longer stay in hospital? Again, you can kind of see the disruption there. Increased likelihood or propensity of that patient to be transferred or diverted to another facility, whether that facility is within the health system or outside of the health system, and increases in complication for medical procedures. There are several horrific stories out there about patients who are, mid chemo sort of treatment and having to essentially start again or, start to to understand, recreate the calibration of the chemo. I mean, you can imagine how traumatic that would be in what is already a majorly traumatic event. And then most critically, increases in mortality as a result of these activities. So I think the point we like to emphasize here, and I'm really delighted to see, I'm not delighted by these figures, but I'm delighted to see the industry has moved on from security being seen as a compliancy factor or reputational harm or financial harm, all important to be sure. But I think the more we can connect it to patient safety, the better we have found, admittedly anecdotally, that when healthcare embraces it and sees it that way, generally budgets seem to improve and the ability to make the investments in the capabilities, whether that's technology or processes or people, et cetera, to go solve for healthcare cybersecurity problems seems to be more pronounced. So the connection to the mission, connection to patient care is a great, it's kind of like the silver lining in a kind of cloudy, trouble, thunderstormy sort of atmosphere. I mean, the fact that people now see this as a direct connection to patient care is really, really positive. Okay, with that, we want to get on to some threat trends and basically the emphasis of what we really want to focus on for the balance of today's presentations. Where is the threat activity most acute? And this is where I'm going to bring Chris much more into this conversation, so you don't have to hear my voice for much longer.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that what we're going to try to do is look at a lens that makes it personal and gives, I guess, attack surface a different face. And as you mentioned prior, you want to attach it to care and delivery of care so that non-technical decision makers take notice and release funds and actually realize the importance of what practitioners are doing. And I think that this is a step along those lines. If you give the target where the attackers are interested a human face, or at least a job role description, it's a lot easier for the decision makers that are non-technical to understand threat and impact and risk calculations. So I think that if you look at what we're going to talk about as a potential way of communicating, I think that's where it's probably the most helpful, and that's probably the best takeaway that we'll get.
What you're seeing here and what you're going to see throughout the next several slides is we mentioned earlier on the existence of Proofpoint's Healthcare Customer Advisory Board. That's been in existence since 2018. We have worked with them very closely to try to do our best to understand the provider marketplace. So the different types of provider institutions and how a typical, if anything is typical, provider institution tends to work. So what are like using logical groupings to like, hey, what are the top 30 or so main departments that tend to exist in a provider institution? So I want you to understand that framing as we kind of go through this. We're going to be using phraseology like corporate services or therapeutic services, support services. There's a pretty, I don't know if it's sophisticated, but pretty well thought out nomenclature behind that. And I don't know it's appropriate to go into that for this presentation because it just probably gets into too much detail. But offline, we're very happy to talk with anybody about how we got to this point. And so when you see data like this, like where is the attack activity and how does that deviate throughout the course of a year? And bearing in mind here, we're having data that basically goes right up to September. So it's pretty recent sort of threat data, albeit all in a rear view mirror sort of way. Um, you're seeing these departments sort of called out, and we're using, at least in this slide here, the phraseology of attack index. That's just an algorithm that Proofpoint uses to start measuring the severity of attack. It tries to make a distinction between commodity style attacks, which we all get, and things that get a little bit more severe, targeted attacks, etc. So we see a little bit of this activity ebb and flow. But Chris, we see definitely a couple ski jumps right near the end of that data where a couple break away from the pack. Do you want to elaborate on that one a little bit?
Yeah, the numbers really don't mean much. Don't even worry about the numbers. What you need to concentrate on is just this concept of a stack rank. Because the more data, if we took this out over 2 years, 3 years, we've got that data. When we group people, and there's multiple ways to do that, but we use Active Directory that a customer has put in their email data so that when we look at someone got attacked, we not only see their email address, but their job title and department. And we put multiple customers into a peer group, and then we abstract those actual titles and departments to get the labels that you see here. So there is logic behind the groupings, but what we notice is the groupings and everybody from the perspective of the attackers, because this is attacker interest, everybody trends the same because everybody's getting the same stuff until they don't. And that's why at the end of the day, we're tracking a stack rank that is typically has the finance people that are in corporate services more attacked or more likely to create impact than others over time. And you use that as a baseline. And what we're looking for, we see here, which is a big jump in particular groups. And the whole goal is, can we find a system or a way or a methodology to make the problem smaller? We've got this big problem we discussed earlier about protecting data, making sure that it's not exfiltrated or that care is interrupted. Well, can we isolate over time groups that deviate from the norm parallel to how we defend them? Like if you're going to put in MFA or something like that, you might put it into your IT group or your finance group or something like that, similar to this. But the whole goal is, can I look at it and over time, over the course of months, instead of just someone having a bad day or one job role having a bad day, can I look at departments that have become much, much, much more interesting to the attackers in, say, Q3 of 2024, and then use it for planning purposes to say, okay, do I need to treat them differently? And can I move away from uniform security? And how does this map to the risk calculations that I've made? And in this case, it's done the job. We see jumps in particular groups that deviate much, much further from the norm and even above the finance people. So it's working. And all you need to really concentrate on is the stack rank and the deviation from the norm.
Very good. Thank you, Chris, for explaining that. So now in this instance here, we look at what we call in subdepartments. So where you see that deviation from the norm, we want to dig a little bit deeper and to see which departments, if there was like a sub-department within those groupings that was causing or likely causing more acutely some of this activity. And before I hand it over to Chris to kind of maybe elaborate on this chart, one of the things I want to say is this is what we see from a healthcare sort of context sort of standpoint. It's not to say that you will have this exact sort of experience. Your mileage, as I say, may vary. It might vary greatly, but we have a broad enough adoption in healthcare, and we do look at a broad enough sort of analysis of the marketplace that make us feel pretty confident that this is the lion's share of the activity is kind of moving in this direction. We don't always know why. In fact, we very rarely know why it's happening in this way. But anyway, Chris, we see again these sub-departments really break out. Do you want to elaborate on why that is?
Yeah, we want to focus the lens. I mean, the whole idea is, okay, can you get really specific to the point where, number one, somebody will understand that what behavioral health or health information management or, the specificity that the research that the attackers are doing to find the right person, can that also be used to reflect to decision makers, hey, look, there's urgency and there's a need to act or add controls as quickly as possible. One of the things that I look at this, and we're getting really specific on where the increase in at least action above the noise from an interest perspective is that when we first started doing this, we broke it down on, okay, is interest here a threat to life, a threat to finances, or a threat to brand? And we assumed if we were going to do something like this over the year, that we would see crazy spikes or all of the danger would be state actors that were going after biomedical and clinical engineering titles and things like that, and the sky was about to fall. And as you can see here, that the biomedical and the clinical engineering aren't represented in the big spike. And you typically, to get on our radar, you've got to be at least well above the average, and you've got to beat out the finance types because that's what everybody's looking for. And in this case, we see big spikes in interest in behavioral health and social services, and we'll get into the actual specific titles on the next slide. But the whole idea was, I thought this was going to be, threat to life. They're going to brick some device and there's going to be, killware, if you will. But what's helpful about this is knowing that, the data is going to do what the data is going to do, and it doesn't necessarily behave in ways you want it to, but it's a way to look at the attacker's perspective of a healthcare organization and then kind of understand what we typically hear people say is that's really what we're concerned about. We think that the highest risk is somebody that is going to interrupt a surgery or something like that. And then to see that the attackers are actually more interested in financial gain, or in this case, perhaps data that is revolving around client notes from a psychologist or something like that. And it doesn't mean that you should shift the risk or the impact you assume for, risk to life kind of stuff. But it's good to know that, hey, look, I can also essentially use the scalpel to carve out budget for what I'm going to need to experience on a daily basis. And this is going to be, if it rains, I get wet. And if I don't account for this stuff and realize how the attackers see me and take care of what I'm going to experience threats to daily, I could have significant impact over the course of the year. So the idea is to really get a good understanding of where the attackers are interested in the organization and a way that you can communicate it so that you can account for it after you've accounted for your main priority, which is the threat to life, or the people have told us that's what they're most accounting for first in a prioritized manner.
So again, we now go a little bit deeper. So within behavioral health and within social services, what are the actual job titles that are most attacked? Like what are we seeing there? And again, this is where we're trying to get really, really granular, provide a point of view, always with this overarching perspective that when we talk to healthcare institutions, as we do very, very regularly, um, we understand that there's never a case here where budget's plentiful, resources are plentiful, people are plentiful, and that you have to make some choices about where you want to make your security controls investment. And we're not even trying to say what controls you should be considering right here. We're just trying to say, here's an understanding of the landscape, understanding where the attack activities most likely happening is a strong variable that should be considered when you think about those controls. And so, Chris, do you want to talk about what we saw here?
Yep, attackers do research, and in this case, it's reflected in essentially every criteria that we can track. So uh, the attack index is just, hey, somebody's getting threats that are above the noise. The average number of messages is simply the volume that you're going to have to deal with on a monthly basis per person. And then clicks is really, it's a vulnerability to well-formed attacks. And hey, is my user vulnerable to falling for a good lure? And we see all of the criteria that you could say, what is the cumulative danger factor, and it's going up on every axis. So what was actually jumping in all of these was specific titles. So it came down to, hey, we did a search on, if you had the keyword psychologist, if you had the keyword social worker and social service, okay, look, I think we've done the taxonomy right here because we found these people. But what we're also seeing is that there is a very, very specific amount of interest in the scam that says, I really wanted a psychologist. I went out and did the work necessary to see that it was delivered to these titles and that they got the lure, and what they looked at was something that would matter to them to get them to interact with this. And it was for the psychologist and it was for the social worker. And now we're left with the speculation of, okay, why might that be? Might they want and think that if we ransomed notes on therapy meetings or things like that with very personal information, that the customer might pay out more from a ransomware perspective? Could be that. It could be that you now have a trusted email to now go try to scam someone else. Could be a number of things. All we're trying to do is to say, look, from a planning perspective, if you're going to add controls, maybe you would start here because that's what's happening in the field. And it's a way that is communicable to non-technical leadership. And, they understand parts of the organization and what they are from an impact perspective. And so if you can use things like a social worker was really interesting to attackers in Q3, and so was psychologist. And it doesn't look like it's a coincidence. And it was over 53 different hospital systems. Our mileage is going to vary, but maybe we could extrapolate that that's going to happen here too. We're starting to make the problem smaller, and we're starting to realize that not everybody is protected the same way or has to be, and that maybe a minority of the users present a majority of the risk.
Right. And I think it's worth just emphasizing that Chris and I have been looking at this data for probably, or data like this, I should say, for 5+ years, and probably closer to 6 or 7 actually. But we these no longer surprise us. I mean, there was a time, I don't know, back in 2020 or 2019 when we saw, for example, hospice care workers being heavily attacked, which is the first time we'd seen that. That kind of startled us, but unfortunately, we see that as a threat activity or as a job title still get heavily attacked. It kind of ebbs and flows, and it kind of reappears frequently. But I guess the point here is, like, we feel confident that these job titles are attacked. Sometimes we have a feeling, sometimes we don't have a feeling about why, or many times we don't have a feeling for why. But this is these are not one-off. These are reoccurring themes, and people who are interesting for whatever reason to threat actors. And I think it's a point you touched on a little bit, Chris. But as I move on to the next slide here, I want to make sure we tuck on this a little bit further. Is that we should never I can't emphasize enough how much social engineering goes into these attacks these days. Threat actors spending time on the various um, uh, social channels, try to carve out a picture of your organization, or just dipping into the dark web where a lot of the data just now lives, and they don't need to do the actual research themselves, but they can just dip into data that other people have researched. And I think the big difference between attacks today versus attacks several years ago is when there were network-based attacks, you need a specialized level of education and knowledge to launch those attacks. When it's social engineering-based attacks, you don't need much of a knowledge, be much knowledge. So the barriers to entry are much, much lower. That means you see literally small armies of people who are doing this research and doing some of these attacks versus a very specialized network-based attack when there's always a very small number of people who could do this. So Chris, uh,
Well, and what you're
facilities
seeing,
management, sorry, basically
yeah,
doesn't make.
but what you're seeing is that they can get very, very specific in that, gosh, down to the job title, it is, 10x in some cases on some of the criteria, the others. Or, we've got small armies of people that are doing the research and we're using AI to come up with, yep, we got everybody's email on the dark web, but we try to figure out who would be this type of person. It can be done. As you can see, we got facilities and maintenance May 24, and in this case, we're looking at attacker impact, which we'll discuss in a sec. But the point is, specific really helps the social engineering component from the attacker's point of view. The good news from the standpoint of the defender is that it is reflected, if you look at it over time, with enriched AD data in this case. And you can see, hey, I was really looking for something in the facilities and maintenance, in this case in May of 2024, for whatever reason, other than the usual suspects, like the finance people, as opposed to somebody that's in the emergency room. So we're going to switch gears here. And when we use the attack index, we're looking at what they're interested in. All we're speculating there is that, hey, I think that they're interested in this job title more than the other. When we look at clicks and click rates, these are our system targeted attack protection will track a URL and see if a user had it delivered and was clicked on. And they don't get owned, and we just know, oh, hey, they got clicked. They're usually getting a block page, uh, so that we can sandbox it if they're not getting the block page and know about it. But typically, we're showing clicks to the block page after it's been sandboxed. So know that all of these clicks are not, oh, that's someone that's been compromised. It's a way for us to track how successful the attackers would have been had that block page not been there and the sandboxing the URL didn't take place. So what we're looking at is attacker potential impact. We saw attacker interest prior. This is, okay, we found out who was interesting to the attackers. Can we find out who's actually vulnerable to crafty lures and such? And we saw the big spike with facilities and maintenance, but what I thought was more interesting in click rates, these can be fits and spurts, and you see big peaks and then it goes away. But if you look at social services, which is the bright green, you see what is very helpful in this kind of data, which is a trend over a number of months that is increasing. It's a click rate, it's a problem, and it's getting worse. And it's one of these things that, okay, if I can look at that and it's a trend over the course of months and not just one bad month, which might have just been one campaign, it's something that I can now track and I can quantify and I can invest in maybe security awareness training or some type of control, maybe click time protection or something like that, and see if what I'm doing and what I'm paying for is getting better. So if we typically look at the taxonomy in parallel to how you defend, in this case, an AD group, and we said, hey, look, people that are social workers or case managers or things like that, why don't we put in a particular control or give them some sort of education? We can now track it at a group level and see if our investment's paying off. And in some cases, education's all that you can do to protect people that have to click on links.
Absolutely. Um, and again, to that point, we look at where the peaks are happening and digging into the facilities and maintenance sort of job function or job title. We see where these peaks really become outliers. So what's your takeaways here, Chris?
I go back to the first slides, and there's a lot of emphasis on the supply chain attack. And you always, or at least I always, when I come to the data and we're looking at hospital systems, I'm thinking something is they're going to go after some insulin pump and they're going to try to take over, or that's what they're going to use the compromised credentials for. And that's what I'm going to prepare for. Great, but the data does what the data does. And it shows us that, hey, look, the people that were clickers were in facilities and maintenance and they had specific job titles. So like you could go and look at multiple customers and it was consistent. It wasn't just one customer just perpetually getting hammered. It was I've got people with similar job titles and job roles in 10 or more customers that are seeing these same peaks. And if you look, double click, it's a design or construction role, which what we've found is typically somebody that is going to have some sort of purchasing power to buy cement for construction or construction materials. And this is a good data point to understand that the supply chain attack, for some reason, across industries, typically shows up in the construction for that whole budget element that I was talking about. And so it's a good data point to know that, okay, I'm getting supply chain attacks and they're damaging across the industry. Well, can I get more specific and find out where they are in my organization? And typically, if the hospital system is building a new facility or they're building a new parking lot or something like that, what this data is showing is that people have to click on, messages that they're going to get from suppliers and they're going to have to interact with that. And in some cases, that might be the BEC stuff, but this is where you look first. And these type of people, the way that they do their jobs and the money that they've got access to and, a budget over, makes them vulnerable. And you can look at it and see if it's consistent, which we see in click peak 1, and where it's just anomaly in click peak 2. And then you can look at and validate that with attacker interest in social services and behavioral health, the psychologist titles, along with interest came success or vulnerability from the user's perspective. So this is something that you might say, hey, look, we've got to address this group. They're interesting to the attackers and they're vulnerable. And we saw the parallel spike in clicks on malicious messages that we saw with the interest coming in from a threat perspective. And finally, we've got what we typically see with clicks is two peaks and then normalcy from the accident and emergency. And what we did see there, though, was consistency, which multiple customers, the one that was clicking was the trauma registrar. And that may be a job reality or it may mean something, but at least we're doing things to focus the lens and make the problem smaller and get away from uniform security. Let's account for our risk to life, folks, but let's understand what we also have to deal with on a day in and day out basis, because if we take our eyes off the ball, we're not going to be in business by the end of the year to protect the people that are under care in the emergency room.
So that's the data we wanted to share. Um, Chris, thank you very much for that
Sure.
analysis and those explanations. Um, there's a few takeaways here we just wanted to mention. I think it's just reemphasizing things that we've kind of already said. We're a big believer of prioritizing your efforts on where the attackers are, what they're really actually doing. It always feels like when you think in the terms of cyber defense, it's an infinite problem. So the more you can make it manageable and smaller, um, the better off we think you are in terms of your likelihood to have a successful outcome. I guess it's not that different here from any sort of sporting analogies when you understand, how do they try to score goals or move the ball down the field, whatever sport you want to look at. You're trying to put your controls in place where the attacks are most acute. Um, Trying to think about where your status quo is, so your baseline is, and then what are trends that deviate from that to get a little bit of a view or a strong view about attacker strategy or where the landscape is moving to. Uh, understanding that your attack surface is really, really human oriented in both targeting and vulnerability. So understanding that is a better way um, to counter most threat activity. And then lastly, from an organizational sort of standpoint, the more you can look about this or communicate this in the form of risk, we found it to be really valuable to get those in the organization more on board for doing something meaningful to go help with building out your cybersecurity, your architectures, your postures, your budgets, etc. Boards, hospital executive teams think a lot, very frequently in terms of risk. So, what are some of these mitigating strategies? It's just kind of using their language that help them be impactful, and this this sort of point of view helps to drive out that narrative in that risk sort of way. Chris, do you want to add anything else
Yeah, I just want to echo what you were just saying is that like if you can involve language in the risk discussion that isn't technical jargon and that is meaningful, that connects impact, meaning, hey, yeah, biomedical was 10x the attack that my accounts payable was. You make the decision. We've got risk to finance, risk to life. You're going to give me the resources I need to defend them. And I've just explained that reality of attack surface based upon job role and organizational titles that connected immediately. And so I think that the big takeaway here is not run and go get your pagers, but it's, hey, could I communicate like this? And actually be dealing with a really good educated guess of what's going on in the threat landscape, but it's already packaged in a way that I can communicate it in a manner that's going to allow me to get the resources I need to do my job.
Very good. And with that, we said we come in right around 40 minutes or so, and that's where we come in. Oh, we think we have a question coming in, or oh, please send your questions. Yes, if you have any questions, by all means, please put them in the chat box, and we'd be delighted to try to spend a few moments here answering any questions which may have come up. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. Really grateful that you took the time to look at this data. It's not necessary to say that this is your sort of experience as well, but we hope that presentations like this and threat research like this is insightful and makes for a meaningful way to think about your security challenge going forward. Hey, Laura, how are you doing? Long time no speak. Glad you could join. All right, with that, I think we don't have any more questions. So thank you very much for the time. And I bid you all a good afternoon and a great and hopefully restful holiday season. Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thanks, Ryan and Chris. Just to let everyone know, you will get the CP HIMSS credit letter that will be sent via email along with a copy of the recording that we had today. Please take time to do the survey at the close of the session to give us feedback. And additionally, don't forget to register for our holiday social being held on Wednesday, December 4th, with our newly added silent auction for proceeds going to hurricane relief funds. Thank you very much, Chris and Ryan, for joining us today. And we will talk to all of you soon. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you. Okay, bye-bye.